So great, let me start. I'll try to speak for about half an hour. I see that we're starting a little bit late, but I'll try to keep it to about half an hour to leave enough time for discussion. If I can, I'll even try to be shorter than half an hour, because I think the discussion is the most interesting. So thanks everyone for coming. This is a super exciting opportunity for me to present here at B3C in Bilbao. I'm sorry, but I will have to speak in English because my Spanish is not at all enough for this. I'm Johannes Svensson. My name is Johannes Svensson. I work as a researcher on climate change and land use policy at IDDRI, so the Institute of Climate Institute of Sustainable Development and International Relationships in Paris. There I work in what's called the Deep Decarbonisation Pathways initiative. So I'll present that a bit. I'll just say 2 words about this. It's basically a network of in-country research teams. Building pathways towards net zero emissions, but also linking this with the national development priorities. So integrating kind of development priorities and the mitigation. And in this, I work specifically on land use. So that's what I will talk about here. Basically, national pathways and policy packages to low greenhouse gas development in the land use sector. I don't think I need to do this introduction. I just put it here. I'll go through it super quick. But basically, just to say that it's going to be relevant for the rest of the presentations. I will just say it here. AFOLU, here I talk about agriculture, forestry, and other land use. Sometimes I've subdivided this into 2 subsectors: building on agriculture and land use change as a second one. So just mentioning for reference in the next part of the presentation. There is basically the framing that I've used for the transformation of the land use sector builds on both the mitigation priorities, so climate change emissions. The land use sector or the AFOLU sector is behind roughly 22% of today's greenhouse gas emissions. It's also the only sector that on a short-term basis can draw down greenhouse gas emissions or carbon dioxide from the atmospheres to bind carbon dioxide. It's a sector that's very vulnerable to climate change, so adaptation and resilience are key issues. Like both forest growth and agricultural yields are sensitive to climate change. So land use change and agricultural practices are a main driver of biodiversity loss. The sector is very important for rural livelihoods. It employs, I think, directly 1.2 billion people, and it's relevant for the livelihoods of many more. And it's also, for obvious reasons, key for food security. So just to say that I think it's important to frame the transformation of the sector in this way, that we're not only looking at development or we're not only looking at mitigation, but we're trying to include a broader sustainable development goal framing. So I will present research that I did. I will present 2 things basically. First, research that I've done together with in-country research teams in India, Brazil, and Indonesia, and I will present a bit the national pathways that we built together to align mitigation priorities and development in these countries, in the land use sector, of course. And later, I will also present work that I've started to do now with Maria Jose at B3C, and also another colleague, Gabriela, on policy packages for the land use sector. But I'll come to that later. So basically, very quickly, to build the low greenhouse gas development pathways in India, Brazil, and Indonesia, we used a framework that relies both on national modeling tools. These modeling tools are chosen according to the relevance, the political key questions in the respective countries. So, for instance, the Indian team, the Brazilian team, has a modeling tool that's very oriented towards forestry questions, because that's the political priority there. Whereas in Indonesia, their modeling tool is much more capable of integrating peatlands, for instance, just to illustrate that the modeling tools they use are very nationally specific. But we also have a common framework for the analysis of these pathways. So that's where the results that I will present come from. That's also the graph that I won't go into detail on the right of the screen. The idea basically is that to emphasize both qualitative dimensions and quantitative dimensions of the pathway construction. So we have one qualitative pillar that builds on the identification of the main drivers of change in the sector. This includes, in our identification, it includes forestry management, agricultural practices and management. It includes the socioeconomic structure of farms, of agricultural production, and bioenergy and diets. So I'll go through. You'll see that these elements come back as I go through the scenarios. And it's also, I should mention, a backcasting approach, where the idea is to backcast to identify where do we want to be in 2050, and then to backcast from there to make sure that the pathways that we build meet the long-term target, and then that we're able to identify the technology, economic, and policy choices that we need to get to that point. And I should say also, if there's any questions, please interrupt. Well, sorry. If there's any questions on clarification, please interrupt as I go along, and other questions on kind of substance and other things, we can take at the end. Yes, so here, very an overarching, or the overall view of the emissions evolutions in these pathways. We have Brazil on the left, India in the middle, and Indonesia on the right. The graph shows, I found it interesting to look at kind of putting the AFOLU sector, so agriculture and land use, in the context of economy-wide emission reductions. And with this, we can see that quite big differences across the countries. In Brazil, there are very little reductions in other sectors, so the gray area, and in agriculture, the light blue area, whereas really the majority of the reductions come from land use. And this has implications that we'll discuss a bit more in a second. In India, it's a very different picture. Still very little efforts from the agriculture sector. Significant reductions in other sectors, so the gray bars, and a lot of efforts still in the LULUCF sector. And in Indonesia, a similar picture to India. Brazil reaches carbon neutrality, so that's in line with their national goals. India and Indonesia here do not. On the timescale of 2050, both countries have political targets. India has a target for carbon neutral or greenhouse gas neutrality by 2070, and Indonesia by 2060. So we're not able to see those timescales here, but yeah, and these scenarios don't go that far. So in the end, we don't. There's no answer to that question here. But at least Brazil reaches the national goal, and what we can see is that the LULUCF sector, especially, not so much agriculture, but the LULUCF sector, so land use change, play a key role for mitigation. And just a second graph on that shows specifically basically the percent of total mitigation efforts that come from the land use sector, so the LULUCF. The gray area will be the total amount of mitigation that comes from other from all other sectors, including agriculture. And this is very interesting because it shows that in Brazil, the near totality of all mitigation in these scenarios come from land use. In India, it's 2/3, and in Indonesia, it's a bit less than 1/3. Actually, I see now that there is an error in the graph. Sorry, this is Indonesia, and that's India. My bad. Apologies for that. Anyway, so basically, this means that in Indonesia, it's 2/3 of the mitigation efforts that come from the LULUCF sector, and in India, it's 1/3. So yes, then I mean, this graph is it's complicated, but I just wanted to show it to say that in our method, in the pathway method that we use, we try to be as granular as possible, and this is to be able to have a policy relevance of the scenarios. So we have a clear breakdown of the different emission categories, and we also have an analysis of the underlying activities that I will go into after this slide. The main message here, I think, is that we can see that the main emission sources in 2020 is deforestation in Brazil, no surprise. In India, it's related to livestock emission. I mean, manure management and enteric fermentation. So basically, gases coming from livestock. And in Indonesia, it's peatlands. The key areas for mitigation as we go forward towards 2050 is reductions in the loss of natural ecosystems, so reductions in deforestation and in peatland degradation. It's like reforestation, both in forests, but also the expansion of agroforestry. So yeah, again, showing coming back to the importance of the LULUCF of land use, that the main mitigation efforts come from the reduction of the loss of natural ecosystem and the expansion of or the increase of carbon sequestration in managed ecosystems. So here we come into a bit what I mentioned around the underlying changes. So when we see these emission changes, what are the underlying changes in terms of land use, in terms of agriculture that kind of allow these emission transformation, these emission curves? All the three countries have drastic increases in, or drastic is too much of a word, but have increases in the forest surface. Forests, the total surface of forest grows in all of them. that has implications for the land use that's available for agriculture. So one thing that's clear is that grasslands, the area available for natural prairies, for livestock to graze and so on, reduces significantly in Brazil and Indonesia. Again, if something of the, I'm worried about going too fast. So if something is not clear, then don't hesitate to ask about clarifications. Yeah.
And as to plantation forests and natural forests,
yeah,
is it expected that also the natural forest is going to sort of increase over this period, or?
Very good question. I think so. No, the main thing that happens with natural forest is the halt of the loss of, so the halt of deforestation. I think it's and here, like, it's interesting. This is not part. I didn't put this in here, but it's quite interesting to consider how the modeling structure impacts the opportunities available in your scenario. And I know, for instance, that in both Indonesia and Brazil, the modeling structure for increasing forest surface, the modeling structure only allows for plantation forests. So there, in that sense, you're kind of you're limited in your choices in a way that, in this case, doesn't favor biodiversity, for instance. But yeah, so that means that here we really see natural forests. There's a stop in the reduction. Plantation forests, they expand.
Question: why in India you don't have natural forests? Right, that's the question. Well, India has very little or none. Everything is being managed at one point in time, and the forest surfaces will reduce dramatically. So India, in this transition forest curve that you may be seeing in the literature, India is down here, right? So the only possibility for India is to plant forests. And the debate that we had with them was basically for what? And the answer was for bioenergy, right? So, I mean, that's also the sort of political debates interface with that.
Yeah, no, and with India, for the works going into this paper, we figured out that they don't even have in their national statistics. So I haven't verified this myself, but what the Indian team that contributed to the paper, what they said is that they don't distinguish in their national statistics between natural and the plantation forest. And indeed, anyways, it's not I mean, there are the FAO has definitions, but here, since it's a bottom-up exercise, like we work with national modeling teams, they often use the national definitions of what a plantation forest is and what a natural forest is, which means that, again, there are I should have perhaps been more specific about this, but it means that in terms of the definition of the different land use types, there are variations across the countries, and that's, I guess, in a way, a cost that for the writing of this paper we're willing to pay in order to ensure that we're able to work with the national realities. Yeah.
Natural forest remaining natural forests in one of the categories.
Yes.
In the long term, I mean, is a natural forest remaining natural forest? Does that remain a carbon sink, or is it?
I think this is a very cool webinar discussion. Maybe we can leave it for the discussion later. But the definitions, the point is that countries manage their forests in function of their own national definitions. The national definitions are different. In order to harmonize globally, the idea was that the countries should use the FAO definition or explain why the FAO definition doesn't apply to them. Many models use cover change But cover change doesn't tell you if the forest is natural or not natural. You may be able to recognize plantations, not always. So the definitions themselves are a critical issue for the discrepancies encountered into the different estimates. And this is one of the topics that is being discussed and debated in many papers recently about how to harmonize different approaches of models and bottom-up estimates from GHG investments. Because only on forest, the discrepancy found is 6 gigatons per year. If you use vegetation models or if you use bottom-up. And this part of this discrepancy is the definitions.
So also coming back to another thing that Maria Jose mentioned before, indeed, one of the one of the drivers, one of the objectives also that we've seen for the development of the sector in the scenarios is the evolution of the production and use of bioenergy. So bioenergy plays an important role in both Brazil and Indonesia, also in India, but they are not included here because they were not able to provide the quantitative results at the stage of the when we were working on the paper. So again, this here the graph shows the evolution of exajoule the production the evolution of the energy value of production of bioenergy in 2020 to 2030. The value increases starkly in both Brazil and Indonesia. Brazil is already, I mean, today a huge. It's the second biggest producer of feedstock for bioenergy globally. So that's why we see a less dramatic increase in Brazil than in Indonesia, where Indonesia is kind of now starting to target bio. I mean, they have for a while with palm oil, but they're still in an earlier stage of the production of or of the development of a domestic bioenergy industry. But yes, it's interesting to see that it plays an important role for both. Especially in transport, so biofuels, and in heating, so in through what do you call them, like heating centers, like I lost the word, but yeah. Basically, the land use, so this means that the land use dedicated for bioenergy, or the land use for bioenergy, increases in both Brazil and Indonesia. By doubles in Brazil and almost quadruples in Indonesia. This obviously has consequences. It has, I mean, trade-offs with food security, and this is especially so in Indonesia, where the feedstock that they use in the scenarios it comes from wood, so forest plantations, and palm oil, so which means crops that require dedicated surfaces. Whereas in Brazil, they use a lot more residues and co-products from soy and sugar. So in a way, I mean, that's one way of reducing the land impact. But then, of course, I mean, this is again like a topic that requires a full webinar. So I'm yeah, now I opened the door, so I have to suffer my choices. But of course, once you like, there's the feedback of the market feedback. Once you already, like, in the end, and that's also what I've read about Brazil, that even if it's a co-product, so which means that there's no dedicated land for bioenergy production, it's sugar and soy production. nonetheless, it's often bioenergy that's the driver of the land use choices. It's the choices of farmers to grow sugar, soy, or something else is often driven by the prices of bioenergy. So I mean, in the end, it's clear that in both countries, the bioenergy, the choice of betting so much on bioenergy for decarbonizing the rest of the economy has implications for food security. That in these models we're not able to quantify that impact, but I mean, it's clear that it's there. I think yes, indeed. Okay, so one last slide on, so 2 more slides on these scenarios, and then I'll try to wrap up a bit. Just to say quickly that all of what we've seen, so we see that there is a strong demand for increasing carbon sequestration in land via forests, via agroforestry, so trees on farmlands. There's in parallel there is a strong increase in the demand for agricultural for food, basically, through agricultural exports. Is an important, again, like agriculture plays both countries, or all 3 countries, are huge agricultural exporters, and they rely on this for increasing foreign revenues. So that's a big source of demand increase. There is a demographic driver in that all countries see a strong increases in the population. There are dietary drivers in that the total per capita calorie consumption increases. And in India also, I mean, in addition, there is a composition of the diet that changes, so increases the share of animal products in the diets, which of course, I mean, in India that makes sense because the average diet have compared to health guidelines, national health guidelines, the share of animal products are lower than the national health guidelines, which means that, like, from a health point of view, it makes sense to increase. That has implications on emissions, but clearly it's not possible to down prioritize health for emissions. So I mean, this is interesting because it shows that when we look at these 3 countries that we've worked with here, it's not feasible to look to the demand lever to reduce emissions is very complicated to work with, and will again have clear trade-offs with food security. And I wanted to make one final point again, because so where do we land with all of this in a way? Like we have demand is increasing. There is to meet climate targets, we need to increase the land-based carbon sink. So there are a lot of pressures on land use. Now where does that and that obviously, so I mean, in the land use graph, we saw a shrinking kind of total land available for agriculture. This means that the productivity of agriculture has to increase to be able to cope with this land use dynamic. So this happens in all countries. It happens on different products. That's why I have a table and not a fancier graph. But indeed, there is a strong increase in the productivity. So the yield per hectare, with different drivers. But what's interesting to see is that all scenarios assume that this can take place without an increase in the application of synthetic fertilizers. So that's probably the most common driver of productivity increases. This, I think, is a strong weakness of the study. I'm not sure. Like, I think there are feasibility concerns around this assumption, especially since in the coming, I mean, since well, basically what I said in the introduction, like the agricultural yields are very vulnerable to climate change, and as climate change increases, we are likely to see a counterbalancing negative impact on agricultural yields. So yeah, I just wanted to highlight that, like, this is kind of the, in a way, it's the assumption that makes the scenario go together, but it's also there is a weakness there. I wanted to say some conclusions from this. First, AFOLU plays an important role for meeting mitigation targets, but not only other SDGs. It's important for other SDGs too, including food security, rural livelihoods, adaptation, mitigation, and biodiversity. Mitigation in AFOLU is only feasible when the trade-offs to these SDGs are managed. I think that's also a key thing coming out. We can see, for instance, on the fourth bullet, that mitigation in agriculture and via dietary changes is not feasible because it comes with, or at least it wasn't feasible in this work, because we were not able to identify the opportunities that would come with co-benefits to SDGs. Perhaps, I mean, here there was a risk for trade-offs with food security and rural livelihoods if we would mitigate in agriculture. This also reflects a long-standing negotiating position by India. Has very often been very reticent to talk about mitigation in agriculture for the reason of their fearing trade-offs with rural livelihoods, so with farmer incomes and so on. However, of course, there are ways that this could be, that you could reduce emissions while ensuring while ensuring rural livelihoods, and I think that's also something that we need to work on going forward. On the other hand, reducing net emissions in the LULUCF sector is a major driver of national decarbonization. Importantly, also in the short term, in the models, I think there's clearly an issue in the models of underestimating, let me take it in the other direction. So basically, following this transformation of the land use sector requires rapidly putting in place comprehensive national policy packages. I think there is an issue around underestimating or overestimating how rapidly this can be done. So if we say that, yeah, we're going to stop deforestation by 2030, which is the case in Brazil's scenario, this is also identified as a very low-cost option in their model. I think there is clearly an issue around maybe oversimplifying the policy work that needs to be done there, and also underestimating the cost involved in that. So that's why I'm not. Yeah, I want to open for questions and stop talking. So, but I think just to say that that's it's to respond to this need that with Maria Jose and with Gabriela that I mentioned in the beginning, so with B3C, we've started working on so kind of building a method to analyze national policy coherence for the transformation of the land use sector. So I will actually skip now quite, like I have 2 slides left. I will skip this one quite quickly. The main thing here is that I wanted to say is that I think that there is a need to work around the coherence of looking at the policy packages around the land use transformation. This means not only looking at one policy, because we need to coordinate across many different policy areas. So I think that's why we have chosen to look at the policy coherence in a way. I mean, here it's way too small actually. It's a lot to.
Yeah, we can read it.
Huh?
We can read it.
Oh, okay, amazing. Anyways, then yeah, I'm not going to go through it in detail. Basically, just to say that here we've chosen to work with with policy functions, looking at to address the key barriers of the transformation in the land use sector. These policy functions are around, we've identified policy functions around 5 areas. So in policy commitment and pathway design, around the need to provide from the government, a clear idea of where we're going and a clear idea of the finance that will be available to support this. There is another area around the innovation, demonstration and deployment of technologies and practices. So look, like basically the policies in place to support land use managers in changing practices and adopting new technologies towards more sustainable practice. There's another area around the governance of natural resources and ecosystems. So basically regulating to preserve nature, and also providing incentives to land managers in order to encourage the preservation of nature. Fourth, an area around the policy coherence, so ensuring coherence across different ministries, across different policy areas. We have, I mean, clearly we're looking at agriculture, forestry, diets are not unimportant. Bioenergy could also play a role. So basically, just to say that like there are many different policy areas that must be coherent, because if not, I mean, there are recent reports have underlined how big share of agricultural subsidies, for instance, that are actually have negative environmental impact. So then, of course, if you have billions going into supporting increased use of synthetic fertilizers, well, I mean, then you can do what you want on kind of sustainable practices, but you will still, you know, you're walking uphill, and this is not least the case for Europe. And a final category on institutional the institutional capacity, including the kind of the monitoring. Okay, but there, this is just to say that this is work in progress. I wanted to mention it because it kind of comes as a step out of the pathway work that I presented before. And we're yeah, I'm excited to keep that work going forward, working on applying this framework on some case studies, but also anticipating that applying it broadly, we're not going to be able to go in depth. We know that for the land use sector, implementation of I mean, the policy implementation faces a lot of barriers. You're often working towards, I mean, very small economic agents with small farm sizes, small sizes of forester units. So I mean, in that sense, like there's a heavy cost of implementation, which means that to capture that the dimension of implementation, I think it's also important to do more in-depth case studies. So that's also something that we've planned. But yes, I think with that, I want to close and open for all types of questions.
I congratulate you for being one of the first people that is giving highlighting the weakness that as important as the strength. So, thanks a lot for that. Just to say that the intention of the framework that we are trying to put together is also, and that the countries themselves can use it for auto-evaluation, so that they can do their own evaluation and understand where the weakness in terms of the policy packages may be. So that's the idea. And this is why the 6 or 7 countries we are starting to work with, we did a preliminary evaluation ourselves, but we are sending the evaluations to experts in the governments so that they can confirm that our assessment is correct or not. And also to, you know, engage them into continuing to do this process continuously as soon as they progress in the policy priorities. That's the intention. This is what's initiated in a European project that is going to continue hopefully with the support from some colleagues in some international organizations and the countries.
Have a comment on this little discussion that we had during your presentation, which is I think when you're considering which forests are natural, which forests are plantations, I have the feeling that in all these debates, the same consideration on rangeland is omitted. One of your countries is Brazil, which has very important natural rangelands, and I've recently worked there. And for example, in the south of Brazil, in the Pampas region, in Rio Grande do Sul and Santa Catarina, all the advance of croplands is done at the expense of natural rangelands, with big loss of carbon and with also with a weak protection from the government. The government seems to be, well, you know, it also depends on the government, but at least by law, there is a strong insistence on protecting forests, and for example, land owners in the Amazon, I think, have to leave like 80% of low cover by forest. But in the Pampa, it's only 20% that is supposed to be left in a natural state. So basically, they can convert 80% of their parts into soybean. But it's even worse because the 20% that they're supposed to leave natural, they are not supposed to exploit it economically. And the only way to maintain the Pampa ecosystem is with herbivores. And there used to be native herbivores 10,000 years ago that went extinct, and then basically now the natural rangeland depends on livestock. So it's all very contradictory. You see, you're not supposed to use livestock in the 20% that you leave out, and you are supposed to destroy the other 80%, but then finally have no Pampa left. And some issues like that are also misguided. And I think this is a consequence of understanding forests much better than rangelands. And also there, like talking about plantation forests, for example, and the capacity to mitigate. There are some recent papers, for example, that point out how afforestation can actually have a negative radiation balance because of the darkening landscape and also the high capacity.
Don't mix things because the albedo issue, it is not working on the tropics. The albedo issue is more on the northern emission. So you don't need to mix things sometimes.
Okay, well, this paper I can show, it's a recent one.
Yeah, but that's what the modelers do wrongly.
Right.
That's what the models do wrongly because the albedo is not relevant for the tropics. It's relevant for the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere. So and that's what modelers do when they don't understand things. I agree with you that the policy issues in Brazil are complicated. Why they focus more on forests is basically because the very high percentage of emissions in Brazil are coming from deforestation of tropical forests. And that's why they focus on forests, because the first priority was to protect the tropical forest, not to strengthen the biomass or the forest area in the Amazon for several reasons, not only because carbon and emissions, also because water. I mean, one of the drivers of Brazilians to protect tropical forests surface is water, because the whole water cycle in South America depends on the Amazon forest. That's one thing, and so there's two things. It's not only emissions; it's also water. It's also true that they didn't have that much attention to the rangelands. True. They started to be more aware of the functioning of the cerrado in the recent months. And this is why, for example, in protecting ecosystems, the cerrado is the second biome they're looking for after the tropical forests. And probably they need to adapt their policies to actually the needs and the way cerrados and rangelands can manage. I don't deny that. But let's understand why they started with forests. That's the biggest emissions. The Brazilian energy mix is very clean because most of the energy is hydroenergy and bioenergy. So that's the reason why they focus on that. It's energy, water, and emissions. But I think it's very interesting to understand, and I think probably we will talk to you about understanding the livestock side and the expansion of agriculture in the West. That will be very interesting. Where we will do assessment on the quotas.
And indeed, one thing I didn't have time to go. I mean, I already went into too much detail. So one thing I didn't go into was that indeed in Brazil they assume one of the main ways that they, in a way, liberate land for forests is by restoring degraded pasture lands. So and I'm not. This is outside of my expertise. I mean, but I imagine that this is still something that you can do relatively sustainably, but also something that you can do with quite negative consequences. I mean, again, if you restore pasture lands by putting fertilizers everywhere, you're like this. Yeah, I mean, clearly you can do this in different ways, and there I think that's probably that's a blind spot that comes out. So that I think it's a good question around the rangelands or the grassland dynamics that I've noted. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Could you go back to the slide in which you showed the increase of bio energy production? And if you could link this with the previous figure of So in this case, would this be included in cropland, or cropland is mainly for food, and then also plantation forests are part of bioenergy? Like, could you comment a bit on this?
I was trying to include here bioenergy as its own category, because I think that, I mean, in a way that would be the most interesting, but it's not possible because of the different structures of bioenergy production in the different countries. But indeed, so both countries use wood chips or forests, basically plantation forests for bioenergy production. So in the plantation forest, the light blue, there is a part of it that goes to feed bioenergy production. There's also a part of croplands that goes to feed bioenergy production via different structures. Again, like, so it's not in Indonesia, it's a palm oil, so it's a dedicated crop. I mean, you plant it, and the main product that comes out is bioenergy, or bioenergy. In Brazil, there is a complicated dynamic around. You have two co-products. Sometimes it's the actual sugar, like the sugar used for food, that drives the demand. Sometimes it's bioenergy. So there it's a bit more complicated, but at least it's part of the cropland category. Yeah, please, and then Dirk. No. If you have a follow-up, take it, and then.
It's a follow-up, but it's on the part related to the productivity of cropland.
Yeah.
Because I think that it's a bit scary for me that the way you think to tackle this is by boosting agricultural productivity. I was wondering. So I can see that there are some, consequences to this, and one might be, for example, you say that the use of synthetic fertilizers is not like the practice that they would use to boost agricultural productivity. So that's a good sign, I would say. But another one is, what would be then the effect on biodiversity? Because I think that to boost, nevertheless, productivity, you need to go towards monoculture, and there are already some examples that are very scary. Like, I was reading that there are 4,000 types of species of bananas, and we only produce two. And those are basically 99.5% of the production and presence of bananas around the world. So I think that these kind of issues should be taken into account, and to make sure that this boosting agricultural productivity doesn't come at the expense of the other issues that you're looking at.
No, and just to say on that, I agree. I think this is really it's at once a quite important part of the scenarios, because to face the different land pressures. This is in a way something that's, I think, necessary in the scenarios, and I think it's true. Like, yeah, indeed, when you increase productivity in general, you simplify agricultural landscapes. Well, yeah, not necessarily full-on monocropping, but at least you go in that direction. And that, so, and the weakness here is that many, well, no model that we've worked with here is able to integrate biodiversity in any kind of smart way. It's often possible to integrate it through a proxy on natural forest or natural grasslands, like so basically natural ecosystems. But that's only half of the story, because we also know that the agricultural practices that we use to produce well, agricultural products also have an important impact on biodiversity, which means that we can not only look at the natural ecosystems to understand the impact on biodiversity, but we also need to look at how do we produce on the agricultural land? How do we produce there? Some of the, so indeed, Brazil and Indonesia have both explored kind of ways that, at least in Brazil, they explore crop rotations with the legumes. So, I mean, basically, in a way, moving towards a more complicated agricultural landscape, which I think it has good biodiversity impacts. This requires corresponding changes with the demand market. Like, if you all of a sudden produce a lot of legumes, you have to have a demand for that. So, I mean, and I'm not sure that they, like, I think exploring the full everything, like basically the market dynamics you need to support this change is still another area for further research. But indeed, I mean, this is an important point coming out of these scenarios. Dirk.
Yeah, so clarification question quite a little, like, first, like, where do these percentages come from? Do they come from the stakeholders in those countries, or like, how do they manage to define these changes?
Yeah, a good question, and indeed, I probably could have gone more into that as well in the beginning. But so basically, the way that these scenarios are built, it's there is clearly the idea of co-construction. So at once, it's a collaboration between us, IDDRI, and the national modeling teams in India, Indonesia, and Brazil. In the countries, they will always have ongoing kind of engagements with stakeholders. So I know that for Brazil, they have ongoing contacts with Embrapa, with the Ministry for Environment. So I mean, there is that contact, and I know that Embrapa is pushing this crop rotations. So that's one of the reasons why they've included it here. So yes, indeed, in terms of the practices that they choose to explore, it's often in close collaboration with national stakeholders. Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends a bit on how, let's say, how concrete the assumptions are. Like, sometimes they get an idea and they develop an assumption, and sometimes they're able to get like more concrete. But yeah, I guess that depends a bit on what can be provided. But indeed, it's developed in close collaboration with the national stakeholders.
Okay. And second one, you kind of talked about it before, but like, so you say that palm oil plantations are cropland and not forest plantation. Why are forest? Because they are practically trees with respect to our segmentation as well.
Yeah, it's a good question. I might have to double check that to be completely certain. Again, like that's again. I know that the FAO recently published something around saying that palm oil should be considered a cropland. I'm not sure that. Yeah, I need to go back and check. Actually, I don't have it in my head if which category it falls under here. In my head, it's croplands, but yeah, I need to double check that. Because indeed, I mean, by FAO definition, like, you know, having a certain amount of foliage, tree cover, like it could probably also fit as a plantation.
Remember when we did the assumptions on cover content, so not quite similar than as a managed forest,
Yeah.
as a woods forest.
Okay. No, yeah, no, it's a good point, and indeed that has yeah, that has some implications. So it's I'll look that up and see that. I don't want to hold any. I mean, I know the scheduled end was at 13. We're a bit over that time. I don't want to hold anyone, but if there's any final questions, I can still take one. If not, I guess this is Spanish lunch hour. So
Thank you.
thank you.